So I assure you I'm not bitter. No. Welcome to part 2. Let's move on. Now, I said we were going to talk about groups, and we spent like 20 minutes talking about Sigmund Freud, but you'll see where it all kind of ties together here for just a moment, and let's introduce homework 5. Now, this, it says C. Carmen for homework 5. This is an individual assignment. Yeah, we have a couple individual assignments, but the majority are group assignments. So we're going to get groupy, and then we're going to do an individual assignment. Wow. Check out the irony there. What I want you to do, though, is prepare for the coming here. What we're going to talk about is reflect upon a time when you were swept up into a group. That is, when you really began to detach from your individuality and became immersed in the group. So you lose a sense of self, and you replace that with the sense of belonging or group identity. Okay. What I want you then to explore in this case is what emotion was or were involved at this, right? What was the circumstance, and what were the environmental aspects at work, and what was the ultimate outcome? Okay. So I have gone to my share of music festivals. I love music festivals, and sometimes when all the circumstances are just right and everyone's standing up, dancing, singing, the music is just, transporting everyone, and I feel this sense of awe, and I feel this sense of connection, if you will allow those as emotions, right? But it happens under these circumstances, and you can feel it occurring. And then what was the ultimate outcome was a tremendous sense of peace, an increased sense of awareness, and this sense of being very tightly connected to the people surrounding me. Right, so that might be when me is diminishing and I'm being absorbed into this larger body of festival goers, if you will. That might be one example, right? Hopefully you cook up a better example than mine. But that's homework 5, so think about that, and we have some more to talk about here. Let's talk about Le Bon, and Le Bon's psychological group, right? The psychological group, as Le Bon's definition, can be conceived as heterogeneous elements, that is, us as individuals. We combine to create a new being that differs from the individual elements. So that is the group itself. Now notice, if you're a Star Trek fan, Next Generation especially, they talked about the Borg, and the Borg will assimilate individuals from all over the frickin' galaxy, all over the universe, right? And then they become part of the collective, so they become all Borg as a result of this absorbing. And then they share sensory experience. They share emotions, and they devote themselves to the duties of the Borg as members of the Borg colony, right? They're no longer individual elements, they are Borg, right? And that's what they would call themselves, and that's how they would define themselves. When you suddenly invoke the idea that you are a Buckeye, then you're beginning to lose sense of self and beginning to be immersed in the sense of Buckeye-ness, if you will. Strange term, right? So, the cells in the body combine to create the body, right? But you can take this analogy with a healthy teaspoon of salt, but it's where Le Bon is going, and you may or may not agree, which is something that you can do throughout this course, right? But through the group experience mind, the individual increases in power and may come to feel invincible. Think about this. I'm no longer this solitary kind of, impotent, weak individual. I'm now a member of a group, and through that I derive a great sense of power. Notice that often when you see bullying going on, it's a group of people who are doing the bullying because they feel empowered to do so because of their cohesion within the group. There's tremendous downsides to group as well as upsides as we study groups in psychology. As an individual merges with a group, anonymity is increased, that is the loss of the sense of self, and perceptions of accountability. Because I'm a member of the group, I may escape punishment or I may escape detection, right? So, and accountability decrease. Now, many authoritarian leaders count on this, that as they cultivate people as group memberships, they give them a group name, right? And then their individual responsibility seems to diminish as a result of this, and they can do some pretty nasty things, as we've seen throughout history. Now, Le Bon's book, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, right? We look at this. For Le Bon, this is a core, is tied to suggestibility and akin to a hypnotic order. So people then begin to open up to suggestion at the leader of the authoritarian figure, often authoritarian. Group feelings tend to be simple and exaggerated, so don't become nuanced if you want to generate this in people. And this is the downside, is how to manipulate people into being a mob. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Don't try it at home, please, right? Group feelings tend to be simple and exaggerated, and it's much easier to work with those, right? So they're given to extremes of feelings and behaviors, right? So suspicion becomes certainty. That suspicion is nuanced, and it's not all-encompassing. So say, well, I'm kind of suspicious, but it could be this or it could be that, right? Well, no, we want to move people the hell off of that, and we want to turn it into certainty. This is one of the dangers of conspiracy theories or derogatory negative narratives about outgroups. Antipathy becomes hatred, so a mild dislike or distaste or desire to avoid can be whipped up into full-blown hatred. Is hatred an emotion? I know, I keep returning to that question. Admiration becomes worship. Now, this can happen, in a positive sense to a certain extent. Look at the Beatles. When the Beatles came to the United States and Beatlemania took over, the Beatles eventually had to stop touring because they talked about performing in stadiums, right? And they could no longer hear each other perform, nor could they hear themselves perform, because the crowd would just start screaming from the moment they hit the stage, right? So performing live became useless for the Beatles. There was no purpose to it because no one could hear anything. But notice that people are having a good time as a result of this. Now, admiration becoming worship when it comes to Hitler is a whole different story, right? The people idealize Hitler, idolize him, and yet, he was asking them to do extremely horrible things. So, new truths are constructed, illusions, distortions of reality, and there's a narrative that takes place. And authoritarian leaders often take a tremendous amount of time to craft these. The results in potential activation of cruel, brutal, and destructive instincts. So we might go down the street and then just bust up every shop that's owned by a Jewish owner, right? The night of broken glass was when the citizens of Germany just went apeshit, right? And just burned synagogues, attacked Jewish businesses, attacked Jewish people. And that was something that was cultivated over time. They didn't just one day say, oh, we're going to do this. This was cultivated over a long period of time. So stories were crafted that would support affective responses that would justify the kind of behavior that they engaged in. So let's talk McDougall a little bit. We talked about McDougall last time as writing one of the first social psychology texts, right? And we're going to return to both McDougall and Hume's associationism, right? The emotional contagion is perception of an emotional state in others, and notice sympathy and imitation help this. It instigates the automatic process that allows this to occur. So McDougall is really kind of channeling Hume at this time in terms of the sympathy and imitation. And McDougall goes on to say, a merry face makes us feel brighter. A melancholy face may cast a gloom over a cheerful company. When we witness the painful emotion of others, we experience sympathetic pain. And that is that we feel the pain that another feels. And McDougall, as often, it's a blessing when psychologists are good writers, because we're often forced to read what they write, so why not read something that's well written? And McDougall is certainly, I think, an interesting writer. Let's try this. This is an anecdote of sympathetic pain. McDougall recounts while holding a child in his arms, looking out the window at a thunderstorm. There came a blinding flash of lightning, and for some seconds a crash of thunder. The child was pleased by the lightning, but at the first crack of thunder she screamed in terror. Immediately upon hearing the scream, I experienced, during a fraction of a second, a pang of fear that could not have been more horrible had I been threatened with all the terrors of hell. Well, nicely done. But notice that immediate sympathetic reaction to the same level of fear, essentially, that the child experienced. Well, take this kind of and broaden it out. If I want to bend people to my will, if I want them to do things, then I might use these techniques for creating these kind of, if I demonstrate this emotion, then someone else picks up on it, right? And if I do this with enough people, then I can turn a group essentially into a mob. So this emotional contagion, right, is what McDougall's talking about. And a couple questions we can ask: how might it have an adaptive value? And that is, if I see someone startle, right, and get frightened and get up and run away, then probably I should startle and get up and run away as well. Or I might just sit there and go, I wonder what they were doing, and then have the bear that they saw behind me just devour me, right? So we can see where this could have an adaptive value. But it also might work to our detriment in terms of circumstance outcomes and in terms of the self. And notice, to the extent that I give in to this group contagion, then I am losing the self, and we might consider that detrimental. A book here that you might want to check out, Alone in the Crowd, the structure and spread of loneliness in a large social network, and this is by Cassioppo, Fowler, and Christakis, right? And what do we know about John T. Cassioppo? We'll talk more about him. Ohio State, social psychology. Ohio State social psychology has a tremendous legacy within that discipline. So Cassioppo left, I think, when I was in my first year in graduate school, maybe my second year, and he went on to University of Chicago because he wanted to look at this on a neural basis, and University of Chicago had fMRI machines available to him. So he moved there to take it to a neural level. Anyway, let's return to Freud and the extension of the Preceding. This excitation or intensification of emotion in individuals within the group. So I'm in a group, and now, the superego is like monitoring the group and the parameters of the group, and the group saying, hey, it's okay to get jacked up. And you might have been told as a child or taught as a child that hatred is wrong, but man, there's all these people around me now getting all angry and all hateful, right? And now it becomes acceptable because I'm immersing myself in this group. So the conflict, the psychodynamic conflict about behaving violently or hatefully is, the superego is diminishing or being reorganized to view this as a legitimate activity, and the ego then is released from the conflict, and it becomes an okay thing, and so I'm free to surrender to the passions, right? That I can immerse myself in this. And that's part of what's going on, I think, when I talked about my earlier example of being at the festival. I'm not at home taking care of the house. I'm not at school having to be a responsible human being. I'm at a festival where the norm for behavior has changed, and I can let myself go. And that's where it becomes different, right? And that's an extremely pleasurable sensation, right? So the surrender to the festival, the surrender to the mob at the Nuremberg rally that Hitler created, right, is experienced as pleasurable. Awareness of my individuality is diminished. It's not important. Limitations on individual behavior or attitudes, my superego effects on it have been diminished, and a sense of individual or existential isolation, I'm alone in this world or I'm different, is gone, because now I'm just one of the group, man, and we have a purpose and we have a reason for being. And the intensity of these experiences might be tied to group size. The Nuremberg fairgrounds, where Hitler held his Nuremberg rallies, his annual rally, which really whipped people up into a frenzy, they had a capacity of 350,000 people, right? And notice that large football stadiums, when you go into the shoe, you're surrounded by 100,000 people. So it facilitates this on the basis of crowd size. So let's add in a couple other points here. Libido. Add libido to an explanation of the theory that is, libido is conceptualized as love, especially through sexual union, on an individual level. But if we take this to a group level, if we borrow from Freud the concept of libido, what this means is that I merge with the group. I don't merge with a partner kind of in a sexual act, and the two of us become one for that moment in time, which is kind of the idealization of love between two people. Now it's a union with a group, right? But it still fulfills, at least some people will say, it still fulfills the same need. And this is where the pleasure becomes, right, intense, and the group size and the intensity will just then increase the level of pleasure. And I know it's an interesting application of libido, but it makes a kind of sense. It serves to foster perhaps even greater suggestibility, because once I've experienced this, I'll go back for more, right? That was freaking awesome. And with the group leader seen as the parent loving the child, so it brings up that too. And one of the fascinating aspects of Hitler, his long-term companion, Eva Braun, he was never public about his relationship with Eva Braun. And he explained it as such that I am married to all of Germany. And I want to make myself available to all the people in Germany. If I have a wife, then that isn't possible in the minds of the German people. Fascinating idea. The man knew how to manipulate crowds, had a great knowledge of this, right? So it can bind group members more closely together through mutual identification with the leader and the parent. So Hitler becomes the father of Germany, right? And that's kind of how that runs. So anytime you have an authoritarian leader who wants to begin to tell you how to behave, what to believe, what to do, what constitutes good life versus bad life, then they're operating essentially on this principle. As one merges with the group and experiences the pleasure of doing so, group values become introjected. They become part of the person's core principles. Become introjected into the individual to become more like the leader and group members. And note that some leaders will capitalize, on aspects of personality that people feel uncomfortable expressing. So if I'm essentially an unkind person, I'm kind of an asshole, I like to look down on others. If a leader comes to fore who is kind of an asshole, who is kind of unkind, who talks smack about others, then it justifies my being that way. And I'm going to resonate to that leader because they're diminishing the conflict that I might experience from superego. They make it okay for me to be an asshole if they're an asshole. It makes it okay for me to hate because they say hatred is okay. So this is the way people are often manipulated under these circumstances. So, reflection point then. Does it make sense that we're discussing crowd group psychology in a course on psychology of emotion? And I'll leave you to contemplate that, right? Is there something special about a crowd or group that must be explained, at least in part, by emotion? And this is an interesting intersection, right? So let us then introduce ourselves to Stephen Reicher, and his link to his website is available to you on the slide. I really like Reicher. I like his Scottish, right? So he's over in the United Kingdom, and you can find him on Twitter if you so choose. And he shares a lot of good research and also good application of research to what's going on in the world. So I like Reicher. You can find him there. The science of crowd dynamic comes to the fore in the early to mid 20th century. So this is where we start seeing the theorization about these concepts really catch hold. We see people like Mussolini who, coins the term fascism. And fascism, people called themselves fascists. They thought this was a good thing, right, to be fascists. And Mussolini sold that idea and renewed the pride of the Italian people. And presented to the people the potential that fascism, Mussolini, could move Italy to the status of former Roman Empire, right? And they were entitled to do this. So that was the narrative that Mussolini created, right? Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, right? And Hitler understood well the importance of shared experience in bonding followers to leaders. Goebbels, as propaganda minister, took over all media in Germany. So whether it was newspapers, movies, rallies, whatever it was all under Goebbels' control. They had a very, very tight control over these narratives, right? Reicher argues that this ability to do this is a recent phenomenon that industrialization disconnected us from our families. We moved to the cities, large cities, where we operated essentially autonomously, working in the industrial complex. And he said what happened as a result of this is, back in the day when you lived in a small village, there was a village hierarchy. You know, there was the clergy, there was the mayor of the village, there was business leaders in the village, but they kind of kept everyone in check for the most part. And when you only have a couple hundred people living in a village, everyone kind of knows your shame, knows your name, that kind of thing. And so there was a force that kept control on people. When we bring people into an industrial society, into large cities, they essentially become free agents, and they were up for grabs. They become mass society, I guess is the way to put that. Reicher argues this is a recent phenomenon. Social control, as he says, is up for grabs, and the crowd can fall prey to, and I love this term, unscrupulous agitators. So that is, Hitler had an agenda, and he manipulated people to assist him in implementing that agenda, right? Because these people are now disconnected. They're not tightly connected to their village and that very close relationship to, let's say, the superego. Right? So they're able to engage, abandon themselves, and engage in the crowd behavior to a greater extent. So Reicher on Le Bon, what do we know? The majority of Le Bon's crowd text is in fact essentially a primer on how to take advantage of the crowd mentality. And people read this stuff and they learn from it and they use it. Right? How to manipulate crowds, how to recruit their enthusiasms, elevate that affective stream, right, to one's own end. How to manipulate people. One of Reicher's chief complaints about Le Bon is the lack of context. That is, Le Bon really didn't discuss social or cultural context. And it might be because Le Bon came early enough in the 20th century that he didn't have the examples to work from necessarily that Reicher did. Take that with a grain of salt. All right, we're going to go to the next part here, a little more on Reicher, and then we'll move on from there.